Morning, welcome to Casa America. Allow me just a very few words to explain what we are trying to do here. We are hosting a conference by Tim Bennett, CEO of the Transatlantic Business Council, on the TTIP and the Treaty on Trade and Investment Partnership that is being negotiated between the United States and the European Union. The title of this of today's conference is A Business Perspective on Where We Are and Where We Are Headed. As all of you probably know, the European Union and the United States are trying to agree on a treaty that will probably change maybe the commercial relations, not only on both sides of the Atlantic, but also probably the whole world, as we are talking of the two biggest economies right now out there. This series of roundtables and conferences we are organizing in Casa America in association with the American Embassy. I'd like to thank the American Embassy for their support, and especially Amy Bliss, who is here, their cultural attaché. And I would also like to thank not only our main speaker, Tim Bennett, but also Ambassador Fidel Sendagorta, who is the General Secretary of the Spanish United States Council Foundation, and Pedro Rodriguez, who is a former news correspondent in the United States. I promised I would be brief, and I hope I complied to my promise. Thank you very much for being here this morning, and I give the floor to Ambassador Sendagorta. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thanks to Casa de América for hosting this conference, this event today. This is the second time I attend an event in Casa de América about the TTIP in the last 2 weeks. So that shows how the interest that the negotiations of the treaty are gathering in Spain among the business community and among government officials themselves. We at the Spain-US Council, we have our annual forum early September, and we will also discuss the subject of TTIP with our American counterparts, Senator Tim Kaine, who is the chairman of the US-Spain Council, and US officials, including, we hope, US Trade Representative, alongside with Spanish ministers and members of the business community of both United States and Spain. I don't know, Mr. Bennett, which is your feeling? Maybe you didn't have the time yet to speak with people around in Spain, but there is, I think, on the business community in this country, you will find the feeling that there is opportunity for us, more than threats. Of course, there are threats, there's perception of threats in certain sectors, but mostly I think the feeling is that this could be an opportunity for our business and for Spain at large. We have 20 billion trade between our two countries, and a stock investment in Spain in the US of 45 billion, and more or less the equivalent of US in Spain. So our trade and investment is quite relevant, and we feel it could be multiplied through this trade agreement. Of course, we know we are in difficult moments of the negotiation, because as negotiations proceed, then the difficult parts start appearing and the resistance are greater. So we will listen carefully to what Mr. Tim Bennett have to tell us. Mr. Tim Bennett has had a distinguished career both in public and private sectors. He has held senior positions in the U.S. government, in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, including as a lead U.S. negotiator in multilateral trade negotiations, the other way around, in Geneva, as chief negotiator for bilateral trade and investment issues with Mexico, leading up to NAFTA, as chairman of 5 interagency trade policy committees, and as the U.S. trade attaché in the U.S. mission to the European Union. He also served in the private sector as senior executive in both large and small tech industry trade organizations. He was president of the Cybersecurity Industry Alliance with offices in Washington and Brussels. He has also served as Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President for the American Electronics Association, as a trustee on the American Education Foundation Board and on American Insurance Trust Board, and as American Senior Vice President International, managing the organization DC Policy Team and offices in Beijing, Brussels, and Tokyo. Prior to these positions, Mr. Bennett has worked in New York City in international public relations with Hill and Knowlton and Fleischmann Hillard. In his last role in Washington before moving to New York, he was of counsel for 7 years at Steptoe & Johnson, a Washington, D.C.-based international law firm, where he served as vice president of Steptoe International Trade and Investment Consulting Arm. Immediately prior to joining TABC, Mr. Bennett was a DC-based consultant providing an array of services in government affairs, association management, and international trade and investment policy. I don't want to add anything more. We are looking forward to listen to him, as well as to Mr. Pedro Rodriguez, who has who knows very well the atmosphere of interplay of Congress and the executive branch in Washington, as he was for many years a correspondent in DC. But I give the floor to Mr. Tim Bennett now.
Thank you very much, Fidel. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much to the Casa de América for inviting me. And I must tell you that this is my first trip to Madrid, despite my extensive experience working in U.S. European affairs. And I am absolutely astonished at how beautiful the city is. I've certainly enjoyed it for the last several days. I look forward to the rest of the week here and to return trips in the future. Now, Fidel mentioned the economic challenges we have. And that is one of the primary reasons that the United States and the European Union have launched into this massive negotiation on trade and investment issues called the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I find that it is it's much more than just a free trade agreement. It is an attempt to develop a more integrated economic space between the United States and the European Union. And why did the governments launch into this when they have engaged in bilateral trade negotiations for 30 years on a host of individual issues, oftentimes agricultural issues, things from canned fruit to wheat flour to sugar, that oftentimes weren't even resolved, but resulted in a Wall Street Journal headline when I was posted in Brussels, the U.S. and the European communities at that time on the threshold of a trade war. But we now find ourselves in a situation where the world has gone from very few free trade agreements to almost 525 bilateral or plurilateral preferential trade agreements. And finally, the two largest trading blocs are now coming to the table to do the same. Well, the reasons for this are because both the U.S. and the EU are suffering from low growth, slow growth, no growth, and massive unemployment. We hear more about it in the EU, but the U.S. also has a large degree of unemployment, much of it unseen, the same as we see here in the EU. And Spain, of course, is probably one of the best-known stories, talked about even more than Greece in many cases in terms of the large challenges to increase employment. So the need to further stimulate economic growth and job creation is reason number one. Reason number two is to create, in the extremely competitive international trading system where the pressures of global competition exist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. It's in order to help the U.S. and the EU industries, services, manufacturing, agriculture, help reduce costs, eliminate inefficiencies to the extent possible, eliminate duplication and regulation in order to help make them more globally competitive. And third, a reason that was often overlooked until recent events in Crimea and Ukraine, there was always a third motivation to this agreement, and that is the geopolitical. The need for the U.S. and Europe to strengthen the relationship, the political relationship between the two bodies, the two largest geographic regions that share democratic values, the two largest regions that are the most established in terms of market-based economies, two regions that over, say, the last 20 years had increasingly diverged and become independent because of issues such as Iraq and other issues. This agreement will help solidify and bring the two together to work together in this, as I mentioned, extremely competitive world. Now, will this solve all the problems? Absolutely not. But over the last six and a half years, the United States and the EU member states have used fiscal policy, they have used monetary policy with limited results, mixed results. So in your macroeconomic toolbox, what more can government do on a large scale to try and stimulate additional economic growth? Well, the belief is that the trade policy tool is really the last large macroeconomic policy that the two can pursue in order to create greater economic growth, greater job creation than otherwise would occur. So let's think of like the speedometer on an automobile, and you have the needle, unless you have the digital, but let's go back to the old needle on your speedometer. The hope of the policymakers is that this trade agreement, if successfully negotiated and implemented, will move the economic growth and job creation needle more than would occur without it. And that is why it must be pursued. There are not many alternatives. It is wise government policy on the part of both. Yet as a trade agreement, it is actually more than a trade agreement. It's a trade and investment negotiation that has been burdened, unfortunately, by massive misinformation, primarily in Europe. There's a big difference between the awareness of this trade agreement in the EU member states and in the United States. For the most part, outside of Washington and certain economic clubs in some of the major U.S. cities on the East Coast, there's total unawareness of TTIP. There's a certain personal care product in the United States for cleaning your ears called a Q-tip. And if you would say TTIP to most Americans, they think it was a new type of a variety of that particular product. So there's a massive need for public education in the United States. And our group will be engaged in doing road shows around the United States in major cities in order to try and explain this agreement and why it is so important. Now, for my organization, we are the only transatlantic business advocacy organization that remains. We represent almost equally. We have 71 member companies at this time, and we're equally divided between European headquartered companies and U.S. headquartered companies. So in terms of Spanish companies, Telefonica and BBVA are members of ours. I'll be meeting with their executive teams here later this week, but we work very closely with the representatives in Brussels, and they are very active members of ours, and I hope we will increase the membership of Spanish companies in our organization, because it's a very valuable platform to bring together the viewpoints of U.S. companies. All of our members trade on a transatlantic basis and invest on a transatlantic basis. So we provide the only platform to come together to reach, to debate internally, and sometimes it's very intensive debate, in order to reach a consensus position, which we then share with the two governments. Karel de Gucht, the EU Trade Commissioner in the Commission in Brussels, said to me in his office that whenever we receive recommendations from TABC, they go to the top of my pile, because I know you've already worked out the difficulties, and it makes it easy for the two governments to agree. So that is who we are. Now, what is it that business primarily wants out of this negotiation? Well, it's the regulatory improvements. And the TTIP has three primary components. One is to improve the regulatory environment in two ways. One, in certain sectors, seek elimination of duplication or mutual recognition of regulations. And in those sectors will include pharmaceuticals, chemicals, automobiles, cosmetics, medical equipment, and also an examination in the information technology and communications area, looking at certain issues such as electronic health records, e-accessibility, and encryption. More broadly, it's not to eliminate regulations or to lower any regulations. That has been a false claim that we've heard from the opponents to this agreement. But it's really to look to the future. Can the two sides, the EU and the United States, agree to an obligation in the text of the agreement to consult in future regulatory development, to look at the transatlantic impact of proposed new regulations? It would not include an obligation to accept the position of the other side. It does not include an obligation to change, but it includes an obligation to consult. Regulators on both sides, and I would say the U.S. regulators are probably more guilty of this than in the EU, have historically had a very narrow focus. What is the domestic impact of the regulations? Why, in all fairness? Because in the legislation that created them, that is their mandate. That is their focus, that is their job. And for the U.S., with its large domestic economy, this internal orientation was normal. But in a globalized economy, it is important to increasingly take into account the international impact. And for the U.S. and the EU, historically, 50% of global GDP, now down to 40% of global GDP, and continuing to decline as others increase their role in the global economy. It's important for these two economic areas to come together to reduce the added cost of duplication, to take into account the impact that their regulations, domestic regulations, have on the other side, to see if the regulatory development can be done in a fashion that does not create obstacles to trade or investment. Let's look at an example. Windshield wipers on a car. Let's take a Mercedes or BMW. They're major manufacturing facilities for those automobiles in both the United States and in Europe. The windshield wipers of a Mercedes manufactured in Europe are not accepted in the United States. The headlights, the bumpers, the seat belts, these all have to be changed. The estimated cost of making these changes is about $2,000 US per automobile. Does that make sense? Think about that. So these are the type of areas where, on the sectoral basis, the two governments are working with the industry associations in the context of this TTIP negotiation to see if there can be what we call mutual recognition or acceptance of the regulatory standards on the other side. The same with pharmaceuticals and chemicals. There will be no reduction in the areas of consumer safety or worker safety or environmental protection. That is not at all the objective, nor will it be the result of these negotiations, but it will be to eliminate to the extent possible the amount of duplication and in the future regulatory development to work together. The second major area of this negotiation is market access. And there the two sides seek the elimination of all tariffs. At least we certainly hope so. The U.S. has restated recently its intention to seek elimination of all tariffs, including agricultural tariffs. Unfortunately, we've already seen the EU now seems to be backing off in terms of total elimination of agricultural tariffs. So we'll see how that plays out between now and the end of the negotiation. Other areas in terms of market access where we'll look for improvement would be in rules of origin, customs procedures, customs fees. All these things are called trade facilitation. And in the area of technical barriers to trade or product standards, what we're looking for is mutual recognition or increased harmonization in conformity assessment or of testing. And in the area of testing, what the business community would like to see, that if you test a product once, it will be accepted by the other side. So test it once, accept it twice, instead of requiring a manufacturer to test both in Europe and the United States before the product is permitted to be sold on the market. Now, that is these two areas, regulatory development and in product testing, are good examples of why this agreement will have major benefits for small and medium-sized manufacturers. As a class, SMEs will be the largest beneficiaries of this agreement. Now, a large corporation, a large chemical company or a pharmaceutical company, auto manufacturer, will certainly benefit in terms of revenue saved because of the tariffs and the large volume of trade. But in terms of a whole class of companies, the small, medium-sized will be the biggest beneficiaries because they can't afford, in most cases, to pay for testing, both in terms of the financial cost and the amount of time required. They can't afford, say, a small Spanish company to test here in Europe and pay for that, but then have the same exercise in the United States. It's not just the financial, it's also the human resources. For a smaller company, oftentimes, the chief salesman is often the CEO. They don't have someone based in the United States who can pursue for several months, nor could they hire, say, a law firm to handle this for them. So to the extent that you have recognition of testing already conducted here, and that gives you the right to export to the United States. This will be a major benefit for the small and medium-sized companies. The same with tariff elimination. Tariffs for the big multinational corporations is something they can absorb. The savings from this agreement will be important. It'll be much more important, though, for a smaller company if they no longer have to pay the duty, and in a sense that savings is captured by them and then can be used for travel to the United States, to trade shows, participation in trade shows, to hire an agent in the United States to assist them with their sales and marketing. So in a sense, the percentage gains for a small, medium size is much greater than for the big companies. There are certain sensitive areas in this particular agreement, certainly agriculture. You hear about the issue of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, beef hormones, chlorinated chicken. But I would throw out for the business sector across the board, one of the most important issues is the issue of cross-border data flows. The ability to move data across borders without restrictions and without being required to localize your data in servers located in specific countries. You cannot operate globally, whether a large corporation or a very small company or a micro company that depends upon the internet to market their products globally. I'm talking companies with less than 5 employees depend upon the internet if they want to sell internationally. You must be able to move your data. You must be able to use the internet and let your information flow across borders. So this obligation to protect that right is very important to our U.S. and European members. Now, clearly you get into the very difficult issue of privacy. And with respect to the privacy, our position is that you must respect the personal privacy laws in the EU or in the United States. Now, they're much stronger in the EU, but we're asking for as free a flow of data as possible while respecting the data privacy laws. Now, the U.S. and the EU are currently engaged in bilateral negotiations on this particular issue. There were negotiations, very intensive, 2 weeks ago in Washington on this issue. They've actually been going on for several months. They're getting very close. There are 13 particular points that are being addressed. And as of 1 week ago, 12 of the issues have now been concluded and satisfied. The remaining issue is it's what's called the national security exception, and that gets into the intelligence gathering practices, which have caused a lot of trouble between the ES and the EU, and hopefully that one will be concluded fairly quickly. Now, what's the timetable on this agreement? Well, the two governments are aiming to complete technical negotiations by sometime late summer of next year, 2015. And what they'll then do, they will then initial the negotiated text. They'll actually go through, and chief negotiators will put their initials on every page and go through. That will then be translated into the official languages of the EU, be translated into legal text where needed, and then it'll be sent to the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress for review. So this is then the legislative approval process. Now, there are two issues here. For the EU, we have a new parliament, which takes office next week in Brussels. And we saw that there was a little bit more of a populist trend in the results of the negotiation of the parliamentary elections in late May in Europe. But I don't think that's going to have a negative impact on the consideration by the European Parliament of this agreement when it goes to them. I think in terms of timing, we're probably looking at the very beginning of 2016 when the legal texts will then go to the Congress and to the European Parliament for consideration and hopefully approval. On the U.S. side, there is a major challenge, and that is what's called the Trade Promotion Authority or Fast Track Authority, which already exists as a result of the Lisbon Treaty for the European Parliament, but the U.S. administration does not yet have this power, and that means that the legislative body or the Congress will consider the agreement and at the end, and can consider it within certain time frames of several months, but then must vote on the agreement in its entirety and accept all of it or none of it. That is called the up or down vote. That's the power the European Parliament already has, but the U.S. side does not. Now, the Obama administration has had difficulty in obtaining that authority, and so far they have not obtained that. There will not be a vote on that this year, so we're looking at 2015 for the new U.S. Congress to vote on that particular legislative mechanism. There are congressional elections in the U.S. this November, so we'll have a new U.S. Congress starting next January. Now, what else is happening in the broader context in which this TTIP will be considered? Well, on the U.S. side is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the so-called TPP, which has been under negotiation for almost 4 years and is in its final stages, but in the very, very difficult final stage where you have your politically sensitive concessions which are being requested. Oftentimes in a trade agreement, you can negotiate 95% of the content, but then you'll reach a screeching halt when you reach the really sensitive, politically difficult issues, and that's where the Asian trade agreement now stands. Since the U.S. administration does not have this trade promotion authority, the other negotiating partners, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Australia, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, and Brunei, the negotiation is stalled, although you're seeing a lot of ministerial meetings now being held. The next one will be in Ottawa, I believe, in 2 weeks. Without this legislative tool of trade promotion authority, it's difficult to move the agreement forward. Does this affect TTIP? Well, I would argue that no. For the next year, TTIP is unaffected by this TPP negotiation and this lack of the legislative tool called Trade Promotion Authority. I think TTIP can continue with its technical negotiations for another year, but at that time, about this time next year, I think both the Commission in Brussels and the U.S. administration would be more comfortable if they have obtained this legislative authority in the U.S. Now, if the two sides are successful in this agreement and it's approved by the Congress and approved by the European Parliament, what happens next? Well, I think very, very quickly, Canada, Mexico, and Turkey will come to the table and will seek to accede to or become party to the TTIP agreement. For Canada and Mexico, as a result of NAFTA, the supply chains, a lot of the manufacturing processes are done on a North American basis. For Canada and Mexico not to be part of TTIP would be very disruptive. So I believe you will see those two governments very quickly negotiate entry into the TTIP. The same with Turkey. Turkey has a customs union with the European Union. So were the United States and the EU to successfully negotiate TTIP, that means U.S. goods, agricultural, manufacturing, U.S. service providers could enter into the EU market and freely enter into Turkey, but Turkey would not have reciprocal rights going into the United States. So I think those three will be the first at the door to seek to enter into this agreement. The EFTA countries, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Iceland, are also following this negotiation very, very closely. I met with a business delegation from the four EFTA countries just 2 weeks ago in Washington. They've come through to learn about the TTIP. They will be coming back on a regular basis. The EFTA governments representatives come into my office on a regular basis trying to learn how this negotiation is proceeding, because they will then have to make the decision. Will they enter into the TTIP once the negotiation is completed and implemented? So they're analyzing what is the impact on them. Now, what are some of the challenges in bringing this about, aside from the ones you would expect? You know, how quickly do we reduce tariffs on textile products and apparel products because they still have very high duties? Can we resolve the issues for some of the agricultural products? What about geographic indications for a lot of food and alcoholic products? These are very sensitive, very difficult issues to be addressed in the context of this negotiation. But aside from that, the challenges that we see from the business community is that the opponents of the agreement, oftentimes the non-governmental organizations, what we call the NGOs, have already conducted and engaged in substantial publicity campaigns against this agreement. They have every right to do that and express their concerns. The problem is that there is substantial misinformation that they are putting out about this agreement that has the potential of polluting, you might say, polluting the minds of the politicians and legislators who will eventually have to vote on this agreement. Examples. In Germany, where the opposition has perhaps been most intense and probably has been most intense, these groups are arguing that the TTIP agreement will allow poisoned food from the United States to enter into the EU. They argue that the TTIP agreement will lower the environmental standards in Europe and lead to polluted water and air in Europe. These are probably, in relation to the food safety and the environmental degradation, are probably the most common arguments that they are giving against it, neither of which are true. In making these statements, they assert that the agreement will do such and such. And what's astounding about that, I'm a former trade negotiator myself, the two sides have not even exchanged exact text yet, proposed text between the two sides. So it's hard to assert that an agreement will do such and such when they haven't even gotten down to actually exchanging possible wording for the agreement. The TTIP, the two governments have been very clear on this, as has the business community. Nobody is seeking to reduce any standards of any type. What we are seeking from the business community is to eliminate duplication, and in the future, take into account the impact of regulations on the other side. Take into account the transatlantic impact of regulatory development. So what do these challenges mean for the business community? It means that the business community in the U.S. and Europe can't follow their historical pattern. During trade negotiations, what the business community historically does is it focuses on the substance of the agreement, analyzes the potential issues, and develops recommendations for the governments. And that's what we've been doing. Our organization has submitted 6 recommendation papers already. We are currently drafting this. In fact, we have later today, we'll have a transatlantic teleconference call, to discuss our input on the investment protection and ISDS issue, the investor state dispute settlement issue. And we will submit our comments on that next week. So we've been focused on that. And like I say, historically, that's the approach of the business community in Europe and the United States. You focus on the substance, you monitor, you change or amend your recommendations based upon the conduct of the negotiation, and then when the agreement is completed and goes to the legislative bodies, you meet with the legislators and lobby the legislators and explain to them why you think the agreement is important and should be approved or not approved. In this case, the opponents, they don't have to spend time analyzing details or developing recommendations. They take their documents of opposition, they open their Word documents in their computer where they'd expressed opposition to TPP or the Doha round or an EU FTA with Singapore or EU India or EU Mercosur. They delete the name of the other agreement and they insert TTIP and there it goes. It goes out to all the EU member states and to all the NGOs and expresses their opposition. The arguments aren't even changed. For an agreement that is so fundamentally important to creating an additional economic stimulus at a time of massive unemployment, especially among young people, it is irresponsible to be opposing this agreement with false arguments. The EU and the United States need additional economic growth, need additional job creation. And to oppose such a policy, such an attempt, and this is a difficult negotiation because it comprises much more than a traditional trade negotiation. It's irresponsible to be putting out false arguments, false information, blatantly false information. And when a EU trade commissioner or a U.S. trade representative tries to argue at a public forum that that's false, for the opponents to just say, no, I'm not going to listen, I don't believe you, is not helpful. So my final comments, before I'll let Pedro give his observations, and we'll take questions, is that this is an important time in economic history for the United States and the European Union. There are not a lot of policy tools available to address the issue of economic stimulus. The entire world is really challenged in terms of economic growth. Japan, certainly challenged. There's just a new estimate that I read yesterday about Japan. With it's looking at about 1% economic growth projected over the next 20 years, at the same time that its population is now in permanent decline. Economic growth in China is now down substantially as China now takes on some of the burdens and costs of rapid economic growth. 36% of university graduates in China in last summer's graduating class are unemployed in China. Brazil, which had been one of the major BRIC success stories of the past decade, is now challenged, now hosting the World Cup, hosting the Olympics in 2 years, but having demonstrations at the same time as the World Cup because there are not jobs, there's not money for investment in hospitals, there's not enough money, budget money for investment in schools. Economic growth in Brazil down substantially. My point is that globally, there are challenges to growth. So it is responsibility of governments with the support of business to pursue policies that give you that extra stimulus. That fundamentally is what TTIP is. That is why our business community, our organization, is a strong supporter of this particular agreement, and we hope the two governments are successful in improving this transatlantic economic space. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very important that you mentioned that this effort is not only about tariffs.
that this is not a big deal. Tariffs are, I think, 0.01% of US GDP, which I am sure everybody in this room will love to have that kind of money, but it's not such a big deal in comparison with the elimination of barriers after borders, customer borders, regulations. That's the big deal. I would love to hear from you more, if it's possible, more details about the black holes of this process. I think financial services is one of the big problems in this negotiation. And it's not only that we don't want hormones or genetically modified food, or we want to see American movies, but not all American movies, things like that. I think there are other issues that are even more relevant, and at least in terms of millions and billions of dollars. Also, I would like to, after listening to you, you said that probably this agreement will go through Congress when President Obama is a lame duck president. That means that he will be in the last 2 years of his second mandate. It's a critical moment of any presidency. The presidents are freer, they are able to do things, but at the same time, they lose power very quickly. They cannot manage to do a lot of pressure. They don't, because there is no re-election at the end of the process, basically. And I think that this makes everything a little bit more difficult. And politically, I really think it's more difficult in the US than in Europe. Basically because we are already very accustomed to transfer sovereign decisions to Brussels. And I don't think in the US you have such a tradition. And you start to see black helicopters hovering around very soon, and you have difficulties in doing a great deal of political difficulty doing this kind of things. Congress, of course, as always, has tremendous difficulty in terms of agreeing to do anything, and recent electoral results point to that direction, that consensus is not something that is very easily found in Washington, and especially for a trade agreement. In terms of a schedule, we have been negotiating this for a year, if I am not mistaken. There is another, the 6th round in July in Brussels. And I read The Economist the other day and they say trade talks are not like fine wine. They don't age well. So they were trying to put a fair amount of speed in the process. The problem is that in Asia you have failed a little bit, at least up to now, even though you wanted, the Obama administration wanted to to give more importance to Asia in terms of security, trade, economic development, and everything, the famous Asia pivot. It's not happening in terms of trade, at least from the point of view. Basically, these were the comments that I wanted to add.
Thank you, Pedro. Let me start with the first point that he raised. It's very good. I mentioned that this is a very comprehensive, and the term the two governments use is ambitious and comprehensive. And that's exactly what the business sector wants to continue pushing the two sides. Don't start narrowing down just yet. Keep it as ambitious and comprehensive as possible, because the strong belief is that this is a one-time opportunity, a historic opportunity. A door is open for the reasons we all painfully know, very prolonged. We're now 6.5 years into very slow growth, negative growth, massive unemployment, massive hidden unemployment, decreased labor force participation. So this is what has really forced the two sides to come together. If this hadn't happened, we wouldn't be having a TTIP. The U.S. and Europe would continue to go their own separate ways, but these two basically equal powers would not have come together to seek a comprehensive trade agreement. So it's comprehensive, yet within that, there are already clear areas of disagreement. Financial services is probably the best example. The European Union and our membership, our organization, fully supports inclusion of financial services in this agreement. Financial services, money is the grease, the oil that helps the international trading system operate. It's critical to investment. It's critical to financing trade flows, trade credits. What we seek is an obligation in the agreement for the two sides to consult when developing regulations with respect to financial services, whether that be on capital reserve requirements or whatever. We want the two sides to talk together. Doesn't mean there'll not be a requirement that they agree or that they accept the regulations of one side or the other, but an obligation that at a minimum you must talk together. The U.S. opposes inclusion of the regulatory development side of financial services in the agreement. The U.S. argues that the coordination being conducted within the G20 exercises, within the G20 framework, and also within the bilateral, the U.S.-EU financial markets regulatory development process is adequate. The EU argues those are helpful, but they're not adequate because those two mechanisms have already existed and there are already bilateral talks in those mechanisms, yet there are divergences. And the EU wants to eliminate those. So by our organization, we continue to support inclusion. Now, the fact that the U.S. remains adamant so far, strongly opposed to inclusion, does not mean at the end of the day that financial services can't come back into this negotiation. Politically, it's impossible for the U.S. administration to agree to include financial services until after the November congressional elections in the U.S. But there's the possibility that at this time next year, as they approach the end, that the financial services topic could expand and come back into the agreement. We hope so. Some of the other, the black holes, the chlorinated chicken is one that is the most famous red flag raised in Germany, and with respect to the issue of food safety and poison food. Now, what's interesting is 2 weeks ago, the German Food Safety Agency issued a study saying U.S. chlorinated chicken is totally safe. The European Food Safety Agency had earlier come out with a study also examining this and said U.S. chlorinated chicken is actually very safe. Despite these television shows in Germany, there was an anti-TTIP show in Germany in mid-May, 90 minutes in the evening during prime time, a show just on TTIP, and 95% of the show was anti-TTIP. And the chlorinated chicken is the famous thing. Let me also point out one thing about that, just so all of you fine citizens here don't have your minds polluted with these false concerns about chlorinated chicken. The type of chlorine that used in the United States is actually safer than the type of chlorine used in Europe. Since 2004, the U.S. industry has adopted a new technology that filters out mercury that is contained in chlorine. The EU industry still uses the old technology, so it is a less safe type of chlorine. Now, salad, what you call salad, lettuce, whatever, salad, in Europe is washed in a chlorine bath of this type of chlorine. We use it for our chicken. Here it's used for the salad, but that never comes up. So it shows there's a lot of public education that needs to be done. Pedro brought up a very good point about the Congress, and he's absolutely right. This is going to be politically more difficult in the United States than it will be in the European Parliament. I share his opinion on that. Unfortunately, and it's sad to say this, at a distinguished location, such a very beautiful location, this Casa de América, but the U.S. political system has become almost totally dysfunctional. It is not working. There is no desire for the two sides of Congress, and I don't mean the House and the Senate, but I mean the Republicans and the Democrats. There's no desire to work together. The concept of the national interest, the concept of the national economic welfare is no longer a compelling argument in the U.S. Congress. It is very sad, but it is the reality. The two sides are to the point where they're driven almost entirely by the desire to be in political power. So they won't approve anything that they believe helps the other side. Perhaps the best example is in physical infrastructure in the United States, where substantial investment is needed in our highways, in the deepening of our ports, in order to handle the new container ships, some of our airports. The Congress refuses to pass legislation for substantial infrastructure funding. For the funding of our highway repair, the funding for that expires in August of this year. We're already at the end of June. The Congress still is at a preliminary hearing phase for extending the funding for maintaining our highways. This is irresponsibility, and it's very unfortunate. Why do I belabor this point? Because this is the environment into which this TTIP agreement is going to be headed in the next 18 months. And as Pedro pointed out, it's going to be very late in the second term of the Obama administration. So, the presidential campaigns will be started. In fact, you could say they already have started. So it'll be a very nasty atmosphere. Do I think NAFTA can possibly pass in that type of atmosphere? I do, for the reasons that I mentioned. The economic imperative and the geostrategic imperative. Russian expansionism, I think, has been a wake-up call to many in the Congress. So I think the chances are good. What does this mean for the Asian agreement, the TPP? I think we might have a split vote. The administration is seeking authority in order to trade promotion authority so they can do an up or down vote on both agreements. I'm not sure they're going to get that out of the Congress, and the Congress might split out the Asian agreement and might vote down the Asian agreement. But I feel confident that they will vote for the agreement for Europe, for, like I say, both for the economic imperative and for the political imperative. There's some talk of, and with the Italian presidency, which starts next week in the EU, there's some talk of seeking what we call an early harvest. That is, peeling off some of the areas, the easier areas of agreements, such as tariffs, moving them forward now, and then continuing to work on the other issues, such as the regulations. Our organization is opposed to that. We know the U.S. government is opposed, and we know the Commission is opposed. Our strong feeling is you have to keep this together as a package, as what's called a single undertaking, everything together in order to get results on the most difficult issues. So everybody moves along together on this one in order to maintain an ambitious and comprehensive agreement. So my final response to Pedro is, there's no question that President Obama has lost what we say his political chits, or his political war chest is almost already depleted. He's just in the first half of the second year of his second term, of a 4-year term. but he already has almost no political power vis-a-vis the Congress. So it's very difficult for the administration to get its initiatives to be accepted by the Congress. But in terms of political legacy, which seems to be important to most political leaders as they approach the end of their term, I'm convinced that the TTIP, the agreement with Europe, and for the president also the agreement with Asia, he considers very, very, very important to his political legacy. So I believe President Obama will fight very hard, and his administration will fight very, very hard to have these trade agreements approved.